Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Michael David Fox. I'm the director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, East European Studies here at the School of Foreign Service in Georgetown. And I am delighted to be here with Jill Dougherty and Serhii Plokhy. My job here is very simple. I'm simply going to introduce Jill, but today is a good occasion because we are launching a kind of reboot of her very popular series, which is now entitled Russia and Its Neighbors with Jill Dougherty. And this is the first such event, so we're particularly pleased to have such a distinguished guest to launch it. Jill Dougherty is adjunct professor at CERES. She is a former CNN bureau chief in Moscow. She's a former White House correspondent and has played many roles at CNN over the years and continues to do reporting from hotspots in Eurasia for CNN. And she is supported in this program and her presence at CERES by a generous grant from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So, Jill, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I really am excited. As Michael pointed out, this is the first program in several online discussions about the subject, which is the state of the neighborhood. And of course, the neighborhood being, I wish there were a better term, but the former Soviet Union, that massive geographical swath that encompasses regions as diverse as the Baltics, Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. And more than 3 decades ago, in 1991, as we all know, collapsing Soviet Union set loose 15 new independent states. And that process was tumultuous. The region is still beset by upheaval. And to make the situation even more complex, of course, we have President Vladimir Putin attempting to reunite or maybe claw back some of those regions, or at least part of those regions. And I'm very glad, excuse me, to have Serhii Plokhy. I'm sure that a lot of people in the audience know precisely who he is, but just for the record, he is a renowned Harvard University historian. He is the Mikhailo Hrushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History and Director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. So welcome, Serhii.
Well, thank you, Jill. Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be on this program, especially on such occasion. You are restarting something that was very important, and I'm sure will be even more important given what is happening in quote unquote neighborhood.
Yeah.
Because that neighborhood produced the largest war in Europe and potentially in the world since 1945. So there is a lot to look at, think about, and discuss. So it's my pleasure.
Thank you. Really glad to have you here. I have to add a note here. I have unexpectedly some renovation in my building taking place. There may be a little bit of noise. I am considering it a hybrid attack, but we will muster on and try to, right now it's pretty quiet, so I think we can begin the discussion. Serhii, if I may call you Serhii, it feels a little bit easier.
Absolutely, sure.
Thank you.
Sure, please.
I wanted to start with your book, which is really, masterful. And, you're talking about the collapse, the last empire in the final days of the Soviet Union, which is exactly where we start in this. So I just wanted to read a short paragraph to kind of get us going. This is an enormous subject, as everyone knows. So you wrote, "There is every reason to see 1991 as a major turning point in world history. And nowhere does this seem more obvious than in the former post-Soviet space, where many present-day trends in international relations, domestic politics, and economic relations continue to develop in the shadow of that year that some call annus mirabilis, while others, including President Vladimir Putin of Russia, associate it with, quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century." Probably no Putin quote has been quoted more than that. But I did want to start, and I was thinking about this over the past couple of days. You know, when we're talking about things falling apart, a natural question would be, what kept them together in the first place? And so I guess I wanted to begin with that. We're at the end of the Soviet Union. Obviously, it's fraying, and it had started way before 1991. But what kept the Soviet Union together? And obviously, repression. But there had to have been more. So can you kind of set the scene for then this dissolution, Serhii?
Sure, absolutely. Well, the key word in the title of the book that was published in 2014, so exactly when the Russo-Ukrainian War started, but was, of course, written earlier. So the key word is empire. And as a historian, not just looking at the Soviet Union, but also earlier at the Russian Empire, for me, this is an important term, and I know that some of my colleagues working on the Soviet Union really questioned the definition of the Soviet Union as empire. But for me, the story of 91, the story of what is happening today in the region, is a continuation of the story that started in 1914 with World War I and disintegration of European and Eurasian empires. So this is a long durée approach to that history. What happened in 1917 and around 1917 was that the Russian Empire, like Ottoman Empire, like Austria-Hungary, fell apart. We forget about that. The Bolsheviks had to bring it back together, and they brought it back together with the idea of internationalism, making concessions to the peripheries and to the national projects that emerged or acquired more strength during the revolution of 1917. And in that sense, the idea was that it looked like that what was happening on the territory of the former Russian Empire was different, that the Bolsheviks solved the question about empires, question about the national question, and going to 91, Mikhail Gorbachev was really surprised, really, to learn that he was running over a multi-ethnic, multinational, and imperial or post-imperial space. That was not part of the thinking when he started perestroika, when he started reforms, but that what got eventually into the center of events. And it got into the center of events when Gorbachev started to make not so much concessions to the nationalities, but was started to think seriously about democracy, electoral democracy in particular. And it turned out that that place was actually unable to continue as one place at the moment when some democratic procedures were introduced. The first thing that the Lithuanian parliament did in March of 1990 at its first session, the first day of the session, once it was elected, they declared independence. So circling back to the core of your question of what kept it together, on the one hand, there were basically a very, very innovative Bolshevik policy in terms of nationalities. And second was the dictatorial regime and not just repression, but lack of democracy and lack of the way to really, for a number of ideas, projects, trends to emerge during the Soviet time, during the Soviet control. Once you start opening the society, then different forces come to the fore, and the most powerful force was nationalism.
But when you say innovative policy on the nationalities issue, what was innovative? Because, I mean, the difference between Estonia and Kazakhstan is massive. So what did the Soviets do that was innovative?
The Soviets did what eventually really contributed enormously to the fall of the Soviet Union. They were looking at a set of nationalities, not all of nationalities, Some nationalities were more equal than others. So those that were more equal than others, they got their own union republics. And they were endowed with the same set of rights, prerogatives, level of autonomy, whether it was Kazakhstan or it was Estonia. They were quite different. And that included, again, it depended on the period, but that included certainly in the 1920s, the use and promotion of the national languages, the creation of the National Academies of Sciences, and so on and so forth. And then by 1988, 1989, they found themselves in the situation that they couldn't give a particular rights, let's say, to Estonia or to Lithuania, where the national movement was really gaining strength, without giving the same. Well, it looks like they're saving electricity out there.
Yeah.
So I would, maybe that's not good.
Oh, we can still see you.
Okay.
Oh,
Hopefully the electricity will come back.
we can see you.
Good. So once the question was to give certain rights to Estonia, the situation was that they had to give it to Kazakhstan as well. So it was in that sense the structure of the state was of the kind that you couldn't really privilege one region over another, which is certainly not something that is happening today in the Russian Federation. If you look at Chechnya, for example, and the status of Chechnya, the Chechnya phenomenon was really impossible in the 1980s. The way how the union was structured and how the elites thought about it and the constitutional order that existed at that time.
Yeah. You know, I forgot to say at the top that obviously we're going to have time for questions. And as we're chatting here, as Serhii and I are chatting, you can begin to think of those questions and pop them into the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. And we'll go to the bottom of the hour or so. And of course, there are more questions. So to bring it up to today, we have Vladimir Putin, and some would argue he's trying to rebuild the Soviet Union. Others would take a page from your book and say he's rebuilding the Russian Empire. So what do you think? I mean, what this is really a broad question, but what do you think he is trying to do in the neighborhood? He's obviously trying to rebuild or bring something back, but what is it?
Yes, thank you. I don't remember that page in my book,
Well,
but
just the word empire. Let's take
yes,
that.
the empire still continues to be a very important category. So my understanding, at least, of Putin's thinking and elites around him, because he's not an original thinker, he picks up on certain ideas here and there. One thing is that the line that was taken by the Russian diplomacy thinkers in the 1990s at the time of Yeltsin was that the unipolar world centered on Washington is bad for Russia, and the alternative should be multipolar world. And for Russia, that is not even part of the 10 richest nations, or defined by GDP club. It's quite a challenge how you become one of the poles in multipolar world, because why do you need multipolar world unless you want to be one of the poles in that world? And the realization is that it's in one way or another taken under control the post-Soviet space with its resources, human resources, with its resources in terms of the reach of the land, the coal, oil, gas, you name it. So under those circumstances, Russia could become one of the poles on the world, on par, let's say, with China and with European Union. And Eurasian project in its different incarnations is, in my opinion, an attempt to really get to that multipolar world, with Russia being one of the poles. But then now, and we talked about that, there is no any more uniform approach to all parts of the either post-Soviet space or all parts of the Russian Federation. We talked about Chechnya. So it is more like a very special status. It's a sort of feudal relationship with, or maybe even earlier, going to the times of the Roman Empire, paying off the tribes on the borders of the empire for them not to attack them, and making all sorts of deals. And of course, other parts of Russia treated differently from that perspective. And the same applies to the treatment of the post-Soviet space. In case of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, that's where the empire demonstrates itself in a different way. And that's the closest to what you said in terms of rebuilding of empire, because Putin is driven by the ideas that were transmitted into the late 20th century by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, taken from the writings of Russian intellectuals of the mid-19th century, early 20th century. And the idea there is that is formulated as Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people, which in reality is returned to the 19th century notion of the Russian nation. So Putin's thinking about Russian nation and what constitutes it, and is supposed to include allegedly Ukrainians or Little Russians, Belarusians or White Russians. That is a 19th century imperial construct. And in that sense, that's a more classic Russian empire than in other cases. But generally, there are different forms and different formulas. Again, used, it's one with regard to Belarus, where the very unpopular regime that would be toppled without the Russian support is in place because Russia supports Belarus. And in Ukraine, where the certainly revolt against this imperial policies in all its manifestations has been going on for quite a while, you have the military aggression and intervention, and you have also sending troops into Kazakhstan when there is a transition of power that is happening there, and not everything goes smoothly. So the lesson from the fall of the Soviet Union that Russian elites had learned was that one size doesn't fit all, that you have to be more flexible. And on the territory of the Russian Federation, really not to allow the administrative regions based on the ethnic principle to be in any way more powerful than average Russian region. So it's almost like the reforms of Peter I going, and then Catherine II going to the unification of the at least administrative structure of Russia. So again, they're now much more flexible than the Soviet elites that they replaced and that they despise used to be.
You know, I think what might be helpful, since this is the first in our discussion, if you stood over, you know, up in space, looking at the former Soviet Union, it might be helpful to our audience to kind of look down on it and say, you know, previously for 70 years, this gigantic territory was united in various ways. I mean, there were, you know, political ties, military, certainly, and then economic and other ties, you could argue. So today, if you were to kind of look at that map, I'm going to phrase it this way, but how much of the Soviet Union actually even continues to exist? I mean, I would say Baltics are long gone. Ukraine wants to be gone. Moldova wants to be gone. Belarus staying, I'm not quite sure how happily. And then Central Asia, very different, you know, really changed. So if you could give us kind of a hop, skip, and a jump around the neighborhood, looking, that big picture, how would you describe it? What is this region now?
I would say that there is less and less post-Soviet in the post-Soviet space. And certainly started that with the political collapse of the Soviet Union, but also economic collapse and collapse of the economic ties. That really was a major factor of the 1990s, contribute to the level of the economic downfall that makes the American Great Depression look like a prosperous time. So, and certain parts of those things are coming back, but others are gone forever in terms of the infrastructure, especially infrastructure that is associated with the military-industrial complex. And military-industrial complex was at the center of the Soviet economy, was at the center of the ties that connected different parts of Russia and then different republics of the Soviet Union with Russia. The generation of people who went together to the party schools before 1991 and were together working in the all-union government, which again was bringing people from the entire Soviet Union. That generation is gone, certainly retired. When President Kuchma of Ukraine could have these friendly meetings with the Yeltsin sort of a drinking parties, or with Chernomyrdin, they're long gone. There is nothing that unites today's leadership of Ukraine with Vladimir Putin, generationally, in terms of the experience, in terms of the background. And this is also the story that is happening in Central Asia, where until recently there were the former secretaries of the Republican Party committees, Karimov and Nazarbayev and others who were running the republics. There is change there as well. So that factor is not there. When you look at what is left at the Soviet Union, you can, and the dynamics of how that was happening, you can start with the map of the Soviet Union. You can then continue with the map of the Commonwealth of Independent States that would not include Baltics and parts of North Caucasus. And then you go to the now security and the current security and economic organizations that exist in the region that are diminished now to 5-6 former Soviet republics. And not all of them are there out of their own will. And others are living because, let's say, the case of Armenia, where the Russia and that infrastructure that is created doesn't provide them with the help and the support that they hoped for. So really, we see that the process of that map of the former Soviet Union shrinking from one decade to another, and there are institutional maps that show that process.
Mm-hmm. And then obviously now, if we get into Ukraine, I talked about upheaval at the very beginning. And as you mentioned right at the beginning, there is, a massive war right in the middle of Europe ongoing. You have other places where, there are threats or land held, let's say Georgia. Russia still holds 2 regions in Georgia. So I guess the question would be, traditionally, people would say, well, the Soviet Union collapsed and there really wasn't much fighting. People had worried about civil war, nuclear weapons on the loose, etc. And yet there is upheaval, and yet there are deaths and there's fighting. So where do you put that in the context? What are the prospects for more violent upheaval in the neighborhood?
Yes, I will speak on my behalf, but I wasn't particularly original in 91, really looking at the fall of the Soviet Union as really a miracle in many ways. So the largest Eurasian empire, or one of the largest of modernity, albeit in this different form of the Soviet Union, fell apart without major fight. Of course, there was Pridnestrovia, of course, there was Nagorno-Karabakh and other things, but given the scope of the empire, the space, the history, the tradition, that was a miracle. And I personally believe that while creating commonwealths, certainly the Russian elite is borrowing from the arsenal, not just linguistic, but also political, of British Empire and others, and that we as the world, we can actually have this capacity to learn from other people's experiences, mistakes, and successes, and that the big fall of the empires of the 20th century, decolonization, and so on and so forth, it really produced produced a lot of lessons that somehow miraculously Yeltsin and people around him and the leaders of other republics learned. And the largest Eurasian space fell apart without a big war. And at that time, the concern was also the end of the Cold War, that it could be a nuclear war as well. And now I'm looking at us as a group, as a humanity, much less optimistic and more pessimistic in terms of the ability of learning. It looks like that the empire is going down with the biggest splash potentially out of any other empire before that. Producing war on its own, not being the victim of the global war like were the empires of World War I and then decolonization of post-World War II, but producing a major war on its own. So that is the context that I see. And looking into the future, for me, it's very obvious that the future of the region and to a degree the future of the world depends on the outcome of this war, of the Russo-Ukrainian war. Given the proportion of the war, the impact will be who wins and who loses. It will be very, very substantial. It would define many things in the region and beyond region for at least another few generations. So it is important who wins and who loses in this war. And more specifically, again, if Russia wins, then certainly the Baltic states and Moldova can be a potential next in line. We see what happens with Russia, happened already with Russian victory in Chechnya. Now that Chechens are shock troops in this war in Ukraine, and what make us think that Ukrainians who resist today with such courage are so different from, or the trend can be so different from the trend in Chechnya, that the Ukrainians would not be the troops marching into the Baltic states or Poland. So this is the future really depends on the decisions that are making today, or the decisions that are not being made today. We will see. It is about post-Soviet space, and it is about the international order in general.
I'd like, Michael, I want to make sure you're not left out of this, because you are a scholar of the Soviet period, and I'm sure you have some comments or questions.
I have many, and I've been thinking about these interesting comments. And, Alexandra Matvichuk was here yesterday. I heard her talk, the human rights lawyer who won the Nobel Prize. And she's not a historian, but she very much framed this, the war in Ukraine in the same terms that Serhii Plokhy has been talking about, as a kind of part of a global conflict between autocracy and, pluralism, liberal democracy. And I think there's a real sense that this has become globalized. But I want to pick up on a couple of threads here. One, you've stressed the collapse of empire, in 1991, and the Soviet Union as a centralized, different kind of empire. And this new attempt is very much more decentralized, cutting deals. So in that sense, it's a return to kind of an older model of empire. But when we look at the different outcomes of all the different countries in this so post-Soviet neighborhood, if you want to call it that, you see a huge diversity between, liberal Baltics and highly autocratic Turkmenistan and semi-autocratic states. And, it's not just the societies and the histories of those regions, but I wanted to ask about a couple of things. One is the international factor, right? Because Ukraine wants to become part of Europe. The Baltics want to become part of Europe. And we've seen in like past conflicts, where internet, like 89, right? The international factors really have a huge outcome in determining domestic eventual outcomes. And in Central Asia, of course, they're caught between Russia and China, very different room for maneuver in the Caucasus as well. So that's one thing, is the international factors. And then the second thing is what you said about elites, Serhii, because I think that, yes, the Chernomyrdins are not there, but you have the children of these nomenclatura people are very strong. And you still, in Central Asia, for example, you still see the security organs of close ties with those of Russia. You see lots of people studying in Russia or in China. And so I'm just wondering, and then you have the media influence, where you talk to a lot of people, and they're very pro-Russian because it's the media they consume in places like Kazakhstan in certain areas, for example. So I wanted to raise those questions for you.
Thank you. I start maybe with comment on the international scene in general, because we talked so far, and most of the discussion is focused for very good reasons on Russian attempts of reintegrating the space, the post-Soviet space. And they are not exactly successful, or it depends really on the Republic, as you said. The part of the reason is that there are other integrationist projects that are underway, and they produce different alternatives to different republics. The European Union is certainly a magnet, was for the Baltic states, as it is now for Ukraine and Moldova. But European Union is, and to a degree to Georgia, but again, geography is not working in favor of these Georgian aspirations, among other things as well, but geography in particular. But what my Ukrainian colleagues hear again and again in Kazakhstan and in Central Asia, they're saying, okay, you're asking these questions, you just don't realize the importance of geography. You are bordering on the European Union. We are not. For us, European influences are coming through Russia. And most of the time, this influence is coming from Russia. They're secular, and the republics can have issue also with rising radical Islam and other things. But on the other hand, there are other centers of gravity, and the Turkey is there. In my recent book on the Russo-Ukrainian War, one of the sections there is called The Return of the Ottomans in the region. And the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and outcome of that war so far, just demonstrates how important Turkey is. And then, last but not least, there is China, that provided security guarantees to Kazakhstan. So there are different histories, and there are different geographies of the region. And what you see, those countries are participating in different integrationist projects, and for some of them, being part of the Russian information space, or at least partially, is not just something that is historically inherited, but also something that the elites are, of course, playing for their their own purposes, for their own good. But a general trend, if you look at Kazakhstan, as you mentioned, some members of elite send their children to Moscow, others to Beijing. So this is new. In Soviet times, Chinese students were going to Moscow and to other places, and certainly Central Asians were going to Moscow as well. Now you have this different at least different opportunities that were not there before. So that would be, again, your comments are quite rich, and I think we can talk longer about that, but that would be my immediate reaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. You know, we have a few minutes left. I'm looking at questions. I'm sure that somebody has some questions for Serhii Plokhy. And also, I have to note that Professor Plokhy has to leave at about a quarter of, so we have, 10, maybe 15 minutes for any questions. So please put them in the Q&A function. Serhii, could I move into the realm of psychology, which I almost hate to do, but always intrigues me? We have a lot of colleagues who study memory politics and the role of memory. And in one of the courses that I teach, we get into Soviet nostalgia. And this is, I know, a bit amorphous compared to what we've been talking about. But there is this idea, that the Soviet Union, even though it included the Gulag, was a place that people were equal, and there's some nostalgia for the old Soviet, Soyuz that brought people together. And that has waned, but in some places it actually has gotten stronger. If you look, I was just talking to some people in Georgia, and I'm off to Tbilisi next week for their parliamentary election. And they were talking about the fact that there are, I think it is 20 new monuments to Stalin in Georgia right now. So something is afoot. Can you, give your perspective on that, kind of the psychological space of the former Soviet Union?
Yes, my understanding is that we have two forms of Soviet nostalgia. One is associated with the generation that is now in the process of really retiring from political life, economic and otherwise. The best years of their lives in terms of them being healthy and active and so on and so forth were happening during the Soviet times. Mm-hmm. Somehow Brezhnev became the extremely unpopular leader during most of his tenure, now became the most popular leader in Russia, it seems to me, when they look back at the Soviet Union, maybe short of Stalin. So that is about generational change. That's one part of nostalgia. Another part of nostalgia is something that is being really produced and reproduced by the authoritarian regimes that look for the Soviet Union for justification of their rule. They're looking back basically not to perestroika. They're looking back to the very authoritarian form of government with very powerful repressive system. And in the past, it was just Lukashenko's Belarus that was leading the way in refusing to de-Sovietize. But we see more and more of that certainly in Russia with the cult of Stalin, and certainly with the cult of Great Victory or World War II that really eclipses the level of the importance and celebration of the World War II cult in the Soviet Union. So this is a different form of nostalgia, which is government sponsored and maintained and supported. And looking at Georgia, I'm not an expert on the country, on the region, but I would not be surprised if there are at least two different trends in play. First of all, there is basically less and less democratic and more authoritarian government in Georgia, which is dependent on Russia in many ways. And Stalin, from that point of view, is a good authoritarian model to be celebrated. On the other hand, Georgia is probably didn't produce any other or any better figure for the world history than Joseph Stalin. So it's also about nationalism, right? And that nationalism and cult of Stalin that existed in Georgia after 1953 was there as well. So you see this authoritarianism and nationalism and closeness to Russia. I think I would look at those factors again. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not doing research on contemporary per se. I am a historian, but those would be the factors that I would look at.
Mm-hmm. Michael, you said you have a number of questions. Do you want to jump in?
Well, we do have a couple of questions in the chat, so I know you should notice that. But I do want to pick up one thing about, the collapse of empire in 1991. And Serhii, you and I participated in that discussion of Zubok's book on 91. And what you can really see is a lot of things were kicked down the road in 91 that could be seen as the roots of 2014. And 2014, of course, led directly into 2022 and the Russian invasion. So I'm just wondering how you see that triangle, and in a sense, this is sort of the revenge of the empire now, but how you see that future historians will be looking at those three dates.
And if I could jump in, Serhii, I'm sorry I was looking at the wrong place. So I do see some questions. So maybe you could quickly answer that and we'll try to get a couple of questions in.
Sure. Well, for me, it's basically almost a direct line, not even a triangle. So between 91, 2014, 2022. And in the book that Jill just showed, the cover, that's where we started our discussion, I have a very interesting episode that for me is quite revealing, and it's about Shakhnazarov, and it comes from Shakhnazarov's memoirs, who was a close ally and advisor to Gorbachev, about the attempts of the Yeltsin people to convince Gorbachev to join the project that at that time was discussed of the not Commonwealth, but a confederation that would replace the Soviet Union. And the argument there was that Russia at this point just doesn't have resources to maintain its control over the post-Soviet space, to help and support republics. We need oil and gas now to rebuild Russia. And in 20 years, those countries will come back. So the big war didn't happen in 91 for a number of reasons, but one of them was that the Russian elites consciously were thinking that that's not the end of history. That the history is being parked and postponed for another 20 years, and then exactly in 20 years you see growth in this reintegration processes of different kind, from economic to cultural to military. You look at some of Putin's pronouncements, where I think he is quite honest. His speech on the annexation of the Crimea, where he is so bitter that he said that, well, we explained in 91 that Commonwealth is just another form of Russian statehood. That's how clearly Sobchak, Putin, people around him, that's how they imagined that. So it was the matter of the gathering strength, because in 91 Yeltsin sent troops to Chechnya, but was forced to remove them because they were not capable to fight anything. So again, that is at least one way to look at those events. It's more complex, but that's one way to interpret it.
Well, I'm keeping my eye on the clock here, and I know, Serhii, I'll give you the option of taking this question, which I think is intriguing, keeping it short, and then leaving when you have to, because I know you do have to. But it's a question from Kamin Kirov, and I'd like to take the second part of it. What do you say, if the Russian state is imperialist, do you see the potential for a nationalist upheaval within Russia? Does the development of national consciousness elsewhere in the former USSR portend a similar development in Russia? So, domestic issue.
Yes. Yes, thank you for this question. On the one hand, the Russian elites learned lesson from 1991, so there is no regions in Russia that, and in constitution, they have no right to succeed, right? It was the situation under, at least formally, under the Soviet constitution. Then, as I mentioned already, on paper, the Tatarstan maybe has a little bit more rights than Tula, but not much more. So the sovereignty that was given by Yeltsin, take as much sovereignty as you can digest, has been taken away through different forms in Russia. But that is the constitutional order, which is different. But behind that is the story of Chechnya, which, whatever political crisis is happening in Russia, I have no doubt that Chechnya by now is already ready to depart. It is a state within a state. And the war in Ukraine, to a degree that it produced any protests, any street actions, at the beginning that was happening in Moscow and St. Petersburg. But later, we are looking at North Kazakhstan, and we are looking at Yakutia, and we are looking at discontent in Buryatia, because these non-Russian regions are being taxed, overtaxed in terms of the recruitment, in terms of the mobilization into the Russian army, and so on and so forth. So this is not a particularly new story for me. You look at World War I, and the dislocations produced by the war produced the rise of the national, tribal, religious, and other mobilizations that undermine empire. Whether they would, how far they would lead, I don't know, but certainly the multi-ethnic and multinational character of the Russian Federation is much more clear and much more pronounced today than it was in 2021, and this is the result of these dislocations produced by the war.
Well, I think maybe on that note, we will bid you farewell, but thank you very much, Dr. Serhii Plokhy. Really appreciate it. Again, I got a lot of inspiration. I think this is a great book to get back to and to remember, the empire as it existed, and maybe parts of it still do. So thank you sincerely.
Yes, thank you very much for joining us
for the conversation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Great, thank you. And I think, Michael, if you want to continue, there are a couple of questions, and I'm very sorry that I didn't see them, but we could chat a couple of minutes here, because I think they are both intriguing questions. If you're willing to do it for another couple of minutes.
Sure.
Okay.
Since I'm also historian, I cannot stand in for Serhii Plokhy, but there's a question about the South Caucasus and Nagorno-Karabakh. Do you want to present the question?
Well, let's take it. Yeah. So the question is from Anit Tanoyan. In the case of the South Caucasus, many reports have come out since 2020 that the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh shows a weakening Russian influence. However, there also are reports of Russian oil being sold to Europe through Azerbaijan. Armenia can't seem to get out of Russia's grip. What is the truth of Russian influence in the Caucasus is it really waning? So Michael, do you want to take that?
Yeah. Well, Jill, we might cut. It's not unconnected to the other question about Belarus, because that also has to do with Russian influence. So maybe I'll take them both together, because the second question is from William Courtney about what are the prospects for Belarus after Lukashenko. Based on 2020 protests, there seems to be a lot of popular interest in an end to repression. So I would go back to something Serhii Plokhy said in both cases, that a lot depends on the outcome of the war in Ukraine. Because right now, Russia is tied down. It's a race on both sides, right? Attrition in Ukraine, war weariness, all these horrible attacks on infrastructure and heat and basic, survival. And Russia's economy, which is on a war footing and is being taxed. And Russia, how long can it go putting all its resources, so many of its resources into the war? So what we do see that while Russia, the first year of the war especially, right, Russia's influence on these other parts of the former Soviet Union was dramatically lessened. And then as Russia got back on sort of more successful in the war and in its own domestic repression, was gradually increasing, more pressure. But in the case of the Caucasus, I think, a lot, you definitely see a less of an influence than previously, just because of the war. But now you see a kind of resurgence. And in the case of Belarus, you're really seeing Lukashenko being propped up by Russia. And we do, in terms of Russian security forces, in terms of Lukashenko's cooperation on such matters as the deportation of Ukrainian children and then their transfer to Russia. I mean, there's really, Lukashenko's hands are increasingly tied. So what would happen after these massive demonstrations that were put down with Russia's help? A lot will depend on what Russia is doing behind the scenes. And, the historian, we don't have access to that classified information, but there are a lot of levers that Russia has. Whether it will be able to use them and how effectively will be dependent on the war, the outcome of the war, I think. But you know what, Jill, there was another question there by Kamen Kirov. The first one, what we sort of dismissed already because you asked the second part of it. But if we have a couple of minutes, I could address the first part of it, which, as you recall, wasn't announced, but the question was whether Russia is imperialist or nationalist or a combination of both.
Yeah.
And that relates to the other two, because if it's an imperialist, right, its agenda is to restore and gain territories and influence abroad, whereas nationalist leads more to an assertion of the ethnic Russian element. And I would say here, again, as a historian, it's really the third option you gave, Kamen, which is the imperial nationalist. Or if you read the new textbook by Ronald Suney, who's an expert on both nationalism and empire and their histories, he calls it imperial nationalism or national imperialism, whatever, because in all three of the state formations, imperial, Tsarist Russia, Soviet Union, post-Soviet Russia, you're dealing with a highly statist practice and ideology. So the state is always number one. And that's, it's not purely nationalist, because there are elements of nationalism that were promoted even in the late 19th century, asserting Russian predominance. But if you want to just purely promote only ethnic Russians, you're not going to be able to deal with your multinational state. And it's not purely imperialism either, because, the Soviet Union is a different kind of empire. It was highly centralized. It was officially anti-imperialist, so it covered a lot of things under the surface. And post-Soviet Russia is certainly not in a position to openly recreate empire in the world we live in today. It has to use different methods, in some territorial, some economic, some ideological. But in both cases, the statist element is asserting both the, imperial goals and national goals at the same time in a kind of hybrid or bizarre, and that's why it makes it so difficult to compare Russia to other parts of the world. It's definitely not a nation state, and it's not a classic empire, and it could be in transition from one to the other, but we won't probably be around to know the final outcome of all of it.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Michael. That was really fascinating. I enjoyed this conversation very much. I think it delved into a lot of history and certainly did more than I expected we would be able to do, which is
Yeah,
kind of encompassing this neighborhood. And I'm hoping that people will come back, because we are going to be having every month for the next few months, we'll be having this Russia and the neighborhood discussion, and we'll get into different parts. When we kind of invented this idea, I had this rather cheesy idea, but it was kind of the neighborhood and certain former republics, renting, but not really being able to pay the rent, others being kicked out, others leaving the neighborhood because they simply could not stand living there anymore. And so but it is a useful template, I think.
yes.
Yeah.
And I think one thing Serhii Plokhy said was he talked about sort of decentralizing, fragmenting sort of centrifugal forces, but he also talked about integrationist forces. So there's a lot to discuss going forward.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Michael David Fox, who is the head of our department, the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown. And also a big thanks to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for, as always, its generous support of our programming. I'm Jill Dougherty. I hope you'll come back next time for another discussion.